I think it was Marcus Garvey who once said that a people without a history is a people who are lost. Today we will talk history on Carib Nation, the history of Belize. So don't go anywhere. Carib Nation is up next. I'm David Hines here in Belize. And as I said in the beginning, today we're going to talk about the history of Belize. And we're going to be talking with a person who has a popular history in his head. The couple of days that I've met him, I refer to him as the walking encyclopedia here in Belize. I'm talking about Emory King. Emory King. You go around Belize and you ask anyone about Emory King, and they say, yes, we know him. Mr. Emory King, welcome to Carib Nation.
Thank you very much.
Well, we want to talk today about the history of Belize, both social history and political and economic history. But I want to start off, first of all, by asking you, why should anyone care about the history of a country?
Well, all right, that's an excellent point. Let me tell you, Belize is a country with 6 races of people who speak among them 8 languages. And people come here from outside, tourists and visitors and potential investors, and I often ask, how did all these people get here? Well, if that question is of interest to them, it is far more of interest to the people who live here, who want to know, how did my father, grandfather, great-grandfather come to be in this place? 6 races of people who, by the way, are all getting along well together. We have no problems. There's no racial discrimination, no religious intolerance, no political violence. We've been doing this now for almost 300 years, and it's all worked out fine. It surprises many people who come. I came 50 years ago to Belize, and I've been studying the history of Belize ever since. How did all these different groups of people get here? And how is it that in many cases they were refugees from other wars going on in Mexico and Central America, and yet when they crossed the border, there was no longer any warfare, no killing, everybody seemed to get along fine.
What do you think accounts for that?
I think 2 things. One is that this was a British place. We have British law. And across the borders in Latin America, you don't have that kind of law and order. The British brought law and order, and when people came over here, they realized they were going to get a fair shake, as it were. They did not get a fair shake where they came from, whether it was Central America or Mexico. We even had some ex-Confederates who came down here from Mississippi after the Civil War because they didn't want to be reconstructed by the Yankees. And we've had people from Salvador out of that terrible war they had in Salvador in the 70s. We get Guatemalans, all kinds of people come here.
So your argument, therefore, is that the influence of the British, has that something to do with the relative calm that you experience here?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. As you, I am sure, know, these Central American countries' law is based on the old Spanish colonial laws, which were based on Napoleonic law, which said, in effect, that if you're arrested, we assume that you're guilty until you can prove yourself innocent. Well, you know, that's not the way it works in Belize or in America or London or Kingston, Jamaica. Entirely different philosophy of government, different philosophy of law, and of social justice.
Take us back Um, so, of course, the first people here were the indigenous people.
The Mayas,
The
yes,
Mayas.
indeed.
Take us there and what happened?
Well, the Mayas were doing very well up until about, well, let me see, 1,500 years ago, when they had some serious problems. They'd been doing very, very well for 1,000 years. Built all these wonderful cities that you see in Guatemala and Honduras and Mexico and Belize.
Famous for mathematics.
But they got into trouble in many ways the same way that the world is getting in trouble. Overpopulation, environmental degradation, and an overburden of government. Too much taxes. You had to support an ever-growing bureaucracy and military establishment. And eventually somebody said, I don't need this. I don't have to keep planting more and more corn in order to give to the king to support the army and all those civil servants. And therefore, I'm going to take my family and move off 50 miles and just leave these people. And little by little, everybody moved away and the whole structure collapsed. The people quit building buildings. The aristocracy didn't know how to plant corn. They never had to. And little by little, the Mayas went back to basics, as it were. And this was long before the Spanish conquest.
And now come to,
right.
And of course, let's fast forward now and come to the Spanish conquest, the beginning of colonialism, as it were.
In Mexico, it started in Mexico with Cortez in 1519. However, in 1511, 8 years before Cortez, a Spanish soldier washed up on the shores of Mexico out of a shipwreck and was enslaved by the Mayas and sent to what is now Belize, and wound up marrying a Maya lady and having children, and therefore became the father of the first mestizos in Central America. That was in 1511, 12, 13. In 1519, Cortez showed up, and they told him that there's a fellow that looks like you down there in the south, and he said, send for him. And the man's name was Gonzalo Guerrero, and he refused to come. He sent back word that he was a married man, and he had children, and he was an important fellow in his village, and he didn't want to go. So he stayed. And 11 years later, he fought off, along with the Mayans, he fought off a Spanish army that came to take over and would have taken over what is now Belize. But they were beaten so badly that the Spaniards in Mexico built a fort on the other side of the Hondo River, and they didn't send anybody down here for 150 years, except some missionaries, and they were chased out by the Mayans. Then in 1670, the first British European came. He was a Scottish pirate named Captain Peter Wallace, shipwrecked out here. There's a lot of shipwrecks in the history of Belize. And this Captain Wallace discovered logwood growing up in these swamps, which fetched a large price in Europe. So he started cutting logwood and also harassing Spanish shipping. He didn't quit being a pirate, and he pretty soon had a fleet of pirate boats working with him. The Spanish had discovered gold up in what is now Tegucigalpa in Honduras, and every time they tried to send gold to Havana, Captain Wallace would come out. And in 1722, mahogany became king. Everybody in Europe, because of Chippendale and Hepplewhite and the British cabinet makers in the American colonies and in London, wanted mahogany. It was a beautiful wood, it was easy to work, and the best mahogany in the world grew in what is now Belize. That meant we had to import slaves. There was never a slave market in Belize. There was no ship ever came here with slaves to sell. Whenever the people who lived here needed help, they would go to Jamaica and bring back 3 or 4 people at a time. And that way we built it up. Most of those people were Jamaicans. They had not even been born in Africa. Mm-hmm. Then who came next? Well, from the Garifuna. Mm-hmm. In 1802.
But talk about the Garifuna. They came from St. Vincent.
They were down. What happened is they were a whole new race of people. Before Columbus came, there was no such thing as Garifuna in the world. What had happened was that there was a rather hostile group of Amerindians living up the Orinoco River in Venezuela. Mm-hmm. And hundreds of years before Columbus, these people had come up the Orinoco and crossed the Lake Maracaibo and got out into the sea, which was later named for them, the Caribbean Sea. They were called by the English historians, they were called Red Caribs. After Columbus came, slavery was introduced in Puerto Rico, Cuba, and other places. Runaway slaves, escaped slaves found their way out of the islands on rafts and little boats and logs and however they could get, and the southern drift of the current took them to St. Vincent, where they met the Red Caribs. The Red Caribs and the escaped, runaway, and shipwrecked slaves mated with the Red Caribs and created a whole new race of people called the Black Caribs, according to the English historians. They called themselves Garifuna. And the French first tried to take over the island, and they were beaten off. Then the British tried to take the island in what was called the First Carib War, and they were beaten off. But by 1796, the Second Carib War came, and the British sent more troops and more ships and more of everything, and they defeated those poor people down there, and then they didn't know what to do with them. Well, we got 5,000 men, women, and children here, and they were unwilling to enslave them and send them to their colonies in the Caribbean, because these are pretty tough birds and they're going to create trouble. Well, they were equally unwilling to line them up and shoot them, so they decided to send them to Belize. Well, for reasons which are unclear, they never got here. They were dumped on the island of Roatan down in what is now Honduras in 1797. And it's a little island, has no water, there's nothing on it but coconut trees. They were in serious shape in a few days. There was no water, no food. But the Spanish came over from Trujillo on the mainland and said, we will accept you on the mainland of Honduras under 2 conditions. One is that you swear allegiance to the King of Spain, and the second is that you become Roman Catholics. Well, you know, these people were starving, and
so they said yes.
Amen, let's go. And they
right.
went over there. Well, that was in 1797. By 1802, 150 Garifuna came to what is now Belize, established a village down in the south, which they call Red Cliff, and which we call Barranco. It's the last village before you get to the Sarstoon River, our border with Guatemala. In 1823, 2,000 Garifuna came running away from real trouble in Honduras. Honduras had become independent of Spain in 1821, and by 1823 they were killing each other over politics, and the Garifuna apparently had backed the wrong horse in an election or something, and they had to run. And they came here, and trouble right away. Some of the magistrates said, no, we don't, those are fierce people. They may be cannibals. We don't know what they're going to kill us in our bed, you know. And others said not a bit of it. There's 150 of them down in Barranco, and I've hired them, and they work all right, and they're peaceful people. So they made a compromise and said, all right, they can come, but they can't come north of the Stan Creek River. So the Garifuna established what is now Dangriga and Saint Bite and Punta Gorda. And later on a new village they called Newtown, and then is now called Hopkins. They have become excellent, excellent citizens of this country.
You talked about logwood and mahogany and so on and so forth. During the period of colonialism, what other crops were produced here in Belize?
Practically none. We were not an agricultural or a plantation economy. We stuck with cutting down wood. If there were a little garden patch behind the house, that's all right. But as far as making any crops for export, never happened.
When was sugar introduced?
Well, hardly introduced by the mestizos who came from Yucatan from 1847 to 1912 up north. We did ship some sugar in the 1800s, the late 1800s, but it was nothing. It was really nothing. One of our businessmen imported an old obsolete sugar mill from Cuba in 1931, and it was pretty well beat up by that time, and by the time we got around to the 50s, it was finished. And some Jamaican people came in, the Sharp family from Trout Hall in Jamaica. They had planted oranges down in Dangriga in the Stan Creek Valley, and they started to redo the sugar industry, and it was going along, and they sold it to Tate and Lyle in the 60s, who built a whole new sugar factory in Orange Walk. And our leader, who later became the father of our country, Mr. George Price, the Right Honorable George Price, convinced Tate and Lyle that they didn't want to raise sugar cane, they wanted to make sugar. Therefore, they should take these thousands of acres of land and sell them to the sugar planters in the north. Every little village should have their own sugar plantation, not the villages, but the individual people, so that we have several thousand individual cane growers now. And the whole industry is, and Tate and Lyle is finally sold out, and the cane farmers now own the factory as well as the fields. Unfortunately, world trade being what it is, sugar is in serious trouble and prices are going down. We're beginning to diversify into papayas and bell peppers and okra and one thing and another.
Belize became independent
1981.
1981. But the whole process of decolonization, the struggle for decolonization, actually began
1950.
1950. Talk a little bit about the anti-colonial struggle here in Belize.
Yes, what we call the movement of liberation.
Yes. Started
in 1950. What happened was that after World War II, a number of the people who had gone away to the war, either as military people or as laborers, came home from Panama, where they had worked in the canal zone, from various places in the United States where they had been in agricultural industries or in industrial development, and some from the UK who had been in the military. And they came back home with new ideas. And one of the ideas that they had was that a man doesn't have to work and work and work and save and save and save in order to buy a stove. That you could get credit in places like America where a man can buy a bed and a chair and a table and pay for it over time. And that started the credit union movement in Belize, which spread rapidly and very, very successfully to this day. So that poor people can go and borrow $25 or $50, and then these days they're borrowing $25,000. The second idea that came out of that was that we don't really need to be a colony. We don't really need to sit here and wait for Mother England to say, well, okay, I think we can afford to build a building or we can afford to pave a road. You know, we don't need that. We can make our own decisions. And that started the movement of liberation, which was not a very popular idea among certain people, as it was everywhere. You know, there's always people who said no. But George Price was one of the leaders at the beginning, and a brilliant man and a compassionate man. He spent a great deal of time seeing to it that there would be no violence, no riots, no bloodshed to mar our march to independence. And that took 31 years, from 1950 to 1981.
Self-government came in
64. We balanced the budget, we got out of treasury control in England, and we became an internal self-government. The governor now, the British governor, only had the portfolios, as it were, of foreign affairs and defense. Everything else was in the hands of elected officials in Belize.
Today, Belize is identified both as a Caribbean country on account of culture and language, but it's also part of the continent of Central America.
We're geographically in Central America, and more people are coming in from Central America because our standard of living is greater than Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, Mexico. They come here seeking jobs which pay much more here than they do back in their countries. That has, like everything, is a two-edged sword. Sometimes it cuts for you and sometimes it cuts against you. We are bringing in a lot of people who do not speak English, who grew up with the idea that the policeman is an enemy, the soldier is an enemy, the politician, the judge, these are all enemies. And if you have a dispute with your neighbor, you don't go to court, you settle it with a machete or a revolver. And we've got to turn these people into good Belizeans. They need to learn English, they need to learn the kind of constitution and government and our philosophy of living together. It's a monumental job.
Many of the countries in the Western Hemisphere, in the Caribbean, in Central Latin America, indeed in many parts of the Third World, became embroiled in the conflicts of the Cold War. Countries became ideologically polarized. Belize apparently did not become so much embroiled in ideology.
No, we did not.
Why not?
George Price said it was an alien ideology and had no business in Belize.
Which one?
Communism. Socialism.
Yeah.
There were some very brilliant young men who came back from educated from universities with that idea. But the general public didn't go for it. And George Price said, no, this is not what Belize is all about. And those folks are still with us, you know, but it's not militancy, and we don't, nothing much is happening.
Was there any militancy on the other side?
No, no.
Would you say that capitalism is taking roots in Belize in any serious way?
Mercantilism.
Okay.
Mercantilism. And now tourism is coming along to create a lot of jobs for ordinary people.
Yeah, but let's talk a little bit about tourism, because yes, it does create a lot of jobs for ordinary people, but it brings with it what I call some baggage. How is Belize dealing with that?
Well, we don't know yet. It's so new. We had 300,000 cruise ship passengers last year. And they're talking about upwards of 500,000 this year. But it's the sort of thing, they get off the boat, 3 hours, 4 hours later, they get back on the boat and go away, having left some money, which we think is a very good idea.
You were born in the United States of America.
In Jacksonville, Florida.
And came here 50 years ago.
50 years ago as a kid.
And you consider yourself a Belizean?
Oh, yeah. Have the passport to prove it.
How have you been able, in your mind, to make that transformation?
Took a long time. I was here 2 or 3 years, and I was still rushing up and down the street, going like a bomb, hurrying to the post office to see if I had any mail. And one hot day, I stopped dead in the middle of the street and said, "King, where are you running to? The plane only comes twice a week. If there's any mail, you have 3 or 4 days to answer it. It's not going to jump out of the mailbox and run away." And I started slowing down. And that was only symptomatic of my whole approach. And then I realized that if you're going at things in Belize at that pace, you're leaving behind everybody else, so you're out there all by yourself with no backup. No, you've outrun your line of supplies, as it were. So I started to slow down, and I met George Price in February of 1954. And I was a committed follower of George Price and his political philosophy from then until now, which has helped the poor people. When I was editor of the party newspaper in '79, I ran a little block ad that said about the election that we were about to have, that the philosophy of the party was not that the rich shall have less, but that the poor shall have more. And George was never a fellow who said, we're going to destroy the moneyed class and give the poor people whatever we can find. They never did that.
Not that the rich shall
Not
have.
the rich shall have less, but the poor shall have more.
And on that very, very, very positive and insightful note, Emory King, historian, politician, sociologist,
Oh, dear.
man of the people. It's been a pleasure talking.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.